Hello, I'm Richard with EV4U Custom Conversions, and it's a cold day in Shasta, California in our warehouse here, and so I've got multiple layers on to try and stay warm. Anyway, just wanted to go over a little something with you and let you know that the objective of EV4U is to help you build a safe, simple, reliable, and affordable conversion. That's what we're all about. And we do that through different methods, mainly through our workshops and educational YouTube videos. And so today we're going to talk about cells, batteries, and BMS. So stay with me and we'll give you a little something that you might not be finding or seeing elsewhere. So first let's define a few things. Let's talk about what a cell is, what's a battery, and what's a module. Those are three terms that's thrown around quite a bit, and based on things that I read online, there's some confusion. So first off, let's talk about a cell. This is a AAA cell. This is not a battery, it's a cell. It could be a battery, it's a single cell battery, okay? But this is a cell. It's a dry cell. And all dry cells are 1.5 volts. What determines the voltage of a cell is the chemistry. So the voltage of a wet cell, like lead acid, is 2.2 volts per cell. So if you have a 12 volt automotive starting battery, it has 6 cells in it, and that's 13.2 volts fully charged. It's not 12 volts, 13.2. And it's a battery because it has 6 cells in it. And a battery is just a group of cells. Okay? So that's a battery. This is another cell. This is a D cell. Another dry cell. It's a D cell. Okay? So 2 cells. This is a 9 volt battery. It's not a 9 volt cell. It's a 9 volt battery because it has 6 small cells in there. 1.5 volts times 6, 9 volts. It's a 9 volt battery. So, cell, battery. Singular cell, a group of cells make a battery. A module is a group of cells that it's mainly a packaging ordeal. So they're bundled together and they have a common output. So you have a group of cells, it's basically an individual battery, but it's used, a group of modules will be used to create your traction pack battery. And so, like a Tesla module, and there are other modules. So it's a group of cells that are commonly contained and have common output. So you can have, like in a Tesla, you can have 444 cells in a module. And so that module represents those 44 cells. So let's look at cells and the way that they're wired. And so they can be wired one of 2 ways, and those 2 ways can be combined. So the first is cells in series. So you'll have each cell has its positive and negative terminals, and in series you go from positive to a negative, positive to negative, you know, so the positive one to the negative the next, so forth. And then we have our most negative and our most positive. And so between those, we would have the voltage of all of those combined. When it's in series, the voltage adds. So if these were, you know, say 1.5 volts apiece, we'd have a 6-volt battery. Because we'd have 1.5 plus 1.5 plus 1.5 plus 1.5. Be 6 volts. And then we're assuming in this diagram, in this part right here, there's 100 amp hour cells. So if I have 4 100 amp hour cells in series, I would have whatever the individual cell voltage is times 4, that'd be my battery voltage, and it would be 100 amp hours. If you hook these up in parallel, where you have all the negatives together and all the positives together, then what we have is we have the same voltage as a single cell. So if this is 1.5 volts, we would have 1.5 volts. But the capacity adds. So if these were 100 amp hour cells individually, we have 4 of them in parallel, we have 400 amp hours. So we would have 1.5 volts and 400 amp hours versus 6 volts, 100 amp hours. Okay? But they have the same storage capacity. And that is Ohm's law, which we're not going to go into today, but Ohm's law, if we want to know what the power is of this, your watt-hour capacity, well, power is equal to the volts times amps. Okay? Volts times current. So, in this case, we were talking about, hypothetically, 6 volts times 100 amp hours. Okay, that would give us 600 watt hours. That's an H, not an A. Watt hours. In this example, if I'm still on the screen, and I think I was off the screen. Sorry about that. Let me take a look. I was. Change the camera angle a little bit. Sorry about that. So, there's the parallel example. So this one, we had 1.5 volts, and it was 400 amp hours. So you multiply that, you're still going to come out with the same 600 watt hours. As we had in the series setup. Okay? So the power, the total capacity is the same. But the current that we can draw from this is different. In other words, this is 400 amp hours of current delivery capability. This is only 100 amp hours current. But one's at 6 volts, one's at 1.5 volts. But that's not what this lesson's about. Let's go back and look at, in a series circuit, which a lot of our battery packs are. In other words, some of them are series parallel setup, but for the most part, whether you're using modules or individual cells, such as this Cal prismatic cell right here, you're going to be wiring them up in series. That's what's most common. And in a series circuit, the maximum battery pack capacity is equal to the cell with the least capacity. Kind of like the old chain example. Chain's no stronger than its weakest link. Well, your battery pack won't have any more capacity than the least cell. So we're showing you 4 cells right here, and those cells are all rated the same. So they're all rated at 100 amp hours. That's the cell rating. But in reality, they're all a little bit different. And we've handled thousands and thousands of cells, and they are all a little bit different. And the ones that we get, they come with an information sheet, and they'll tell you what, the internal resistance is, what their measured capacity is, and so forth. So you're going to have the rated capacity, and you're going to have the actual capacity. So in this example right here, we're showing the discharge curve. So we're starting at our charge to voltage right here, and it's going to drop down to this line right here, which is your nominal voltage. And you can see the nominal voltage is fairly flat. And then you get out here to this knee, and it drops off pretty quick after that. Well, in this example, we're showing 4 cells, and one of them's got 108 amp hours. Now there's 110, 112, 114, okay? This is for our hypothetical, just teaching example here. So what happens as they're discharging, of course, the one with the least capacity, it's going to go over that knee and head down towards its minimum voltage, maximum discharge voltage, I called it here, but it's minimum cell voltage. And so that's my pack capacity. Doesn't matter how many cells I have, as long as this is the one with the least, that's my maximum capacity, because it's going to reach that point first. Then the one, next one, next one, next one. But you're not going to allow this one to get there, because you're going to have to shut things off when the cell with the least gets there. Okay? And there's a couple ways that we're going to do that. We're going to get to that in a moment. I just want you to understand that not all the cells will be equal capacity. And that's key to the way that we handle these cells. Okay? So let's take a look at a little bit of a historical perspective. So to kind of get some idea about BMS, which is Battery Management System, to kind of get a grasp on what is a BMS, what does it do? And we're going to go back to the early days of what they did, which was a little more simplistic, but it's just going to give us a baseline understanding. So a BMS, it was to allow all the cells or batteries to fully charge. Well, we weren't using individual cells in the early days. We were using lead-acid batteries, either 6 volt, which had 3 cells per battery, or 12 volts, which had 6 cells per battery. So we were managing the batteries. And the reason they needed to be managed, you'll know in a moment. So lead-acid cells have high internal resistance. And because of that internal resistance, they self-discharge. That's why they have a fairly short shelf life, because it's going to discharge just sitting on the shelf by itself. Now I've got some lithium iron phosphate cells and some lithium iron manganese phosphate cells that I've had since 2009. Voltage-wise, they're the same today as they were back then. They've never been used. They've been for display purposes only. They still have the same voltage. Now I'm sure their capacity has diminished a little bit, but we saw on our transporter in a video we did previously that after sitting in the Mojave Desert for 8 years, they still had their rated capacity. after 8 years of sitting in the desert. So, but with lead acid, that's not the case. They self-discharge. And flooded, the flooded cells are the ones that you had to add the distilled water to. And those have the highest internal resistance. So they're going to have the shortest shelf life. But when we put them in a vehicle, in the early days, commonly we put 12-volt batteries for a conversion. That gave us 156 volts, which made the car, freeway capable. They would do 80 to 100 miles an hour. And to charge them and to make sure that they all were fully charged, the charger would actually overcharge the cells. Okay? And what would happen is the one with the least capacity, that one gets charged first, and so it's overcharging, it's gassing at that point. It's releasing a hydrogen gas. It's boiling off some of that electrolyte. And then the next one, the next one, the next one, till they're all fully charged, and then the charger would shut off. And so periodically, you'd have to check the electrolyte level and fill it. Make sure they were topped off. You didn't want those cells in there, the plates inside that battery, to become exposed. They had to have electrolyte over them. Didn't want them to get to the air. So anyway, that's how you handled that. But some people wanted a cell that was maintenance free. Didn't require that. So then you had the option of going with AGM or gel. The downside to use these in the old days, without getting into a lot of explanation of things here, these required a BMS, and they had fewer life cycles. These, the highest quality flooded traction battery, lead acid traction battery, they only had 300 or 400 life cycles. And the AGM and gel have less than that. They gave up their charge faster because of lower internal resistance. So in the early days, this is what the racers used. They used the gel batteries because, boom, maximum current. They only needed it for a quarter of a mile. So anyway, what the BMS did in those days was it was to allow all the cells or batteries to fully charge. And it did that by monitoring the individual batteries. And when one of them became fully charged, it would bypass that one and continue to charge the others. And each time a battery got fully charged, it would bypass, it would shunt past that battery so that it wouldn't overcharge. Because unlike the flooded cells, the AGM and the gels, you can't replenish the electrolyte. So if they were to vent, they would lose electrolyte and they would lose life cycles dramatically. And so that's what a BMS was in the early days. And so it added about $100 per battery to the cost of a conversion. So if you had 12 batteries, it was an extra $1,200. We only used the flooded back in the early days, and it was because of the life cycles. 300 or 400 is not that many, and you didn't want to take any less. So you had less life cycles, more cost. We didn't go that way. But fortunately, since 2009, we've been using lithium. That's no longer an issue. So now, people still use a BMS. But now, what is the BMS role today with our lithium chemistries? Well, and I got this information from a bunch of different BMS manufacturers. They do state of charge calculations. They offer cell over and under voltage protection, so you can't overcharge or over discharge. Okay? They perform cell balancing, and by that I mean top balancing. That's what they top balance the cells. And we're going to talk about top balancing and bottom balancing in a bit. Battery charge control. What they mean by that is the BMS is what's going to shut off the charger. Battery temperature monitoring, which is important, a couple different angles. One is depending on the chemistry. So some chemistries are much more sensitive to temperature, have a lower thermal runaway temperature, and so those need to be monitored for safety reasons. And then all lithium chemistries need to be protected from being charged at freezing or below. You never want to charge a lithium chemistry cell that's at freezing or below. Okay? And so that's another function that most BMSs will do. And then, so another feature is CAN control. And that's, there are certain devices that are CAN operated that this would allow you to communicate with. A CAN is controller area network. And then system monitoring. So it can monitor things like your 12-volt battery. It can monitor whether or not your contactors are open or closed, whether or not you have a ground fault, things like that. So those are the main features of BMS systems currently on the market. And so I looked at 3 or 4 of the most popular ones and derived this list from their own literature. So next, let's talk about the top balance, bottom balance. What do we mean?